students, welcome back to our course International Security. In the previous sessions, in relation to security studies, international security studies, we talked about realism and liberalism as two mainstream, quite important theoretical approaches, theoretical perspectives in terms of security in international relations. And in this session, I would love to move on with English School and international security this time, which can provide us another theoretical background to study security within international politics. So, English School and international security studies, it's rare to find them actually together, and within the literature it's quite difficult to find the link between English School as a theoretical approach and security studies, international security studies. Whereas our chapter written by Barry Buzan in our case, which is chapter 3 in our major textbook, provides us a quite important and at the same time helpful framework in terms of applying this unexpected theoretical framework to security studies, so to say. So, few, if any, people, therefore, I would say, working within mainstream international security studies would think about English School as a body of either theory or as an empirical work relevant to security studies. But in this session, we will try to highlight the ways in which this unexpected theoretical approach can provide us an important insight about understanding security in general. So, as we did for the previous sessions for realism and liberalism, it's always helpful to start with defining the theoretical framework at hand. So it's time to move on, therefore, defining English School as a theoretical approach in that respect. So the classic English School approach involves seeing international relations as composed of three main elements. So regardless of security studies, when we take a look at English School as a theoretical perspective, it's always important to acknowledge these three elements which is put forward by English School. The first one is international system, and it stems from the idea, more of a realist perspective, and it stems from Thomas Hobbes, a Hobbesian kind of world where man is always in war against each other. And the second element, which you can find in English School, is basically the international society understanding. This time, this perspective stems from rationalism, so a Grottian perspective, so to say. And the third element within that respect can be considered as the world society. So it stems from more of ideas about idealism and revolutionism. So it's more of a Kantian type of understanding in that respect. So it's possible to say that these elements are in constant interplay, and the nature of international relations depends on the balance between these three elements which are put forward and which stems from, in general, as we said, realism, rationalism, and idealism. So in fact, English School puts forward an understanding, a worldview, where there is a blend. It's possible to find a blend of Hobbesian, Grotius, and Kantian type of worldview, type of understanding in relation to international relations. So, in principle, it's possible to say that there is a bridge between English School and the international security studies via the realism element in English School theory. So, remember what we said before we start at the very beginning of the session. It's rare to find English School being used in international security studies. Nevertheless, the chapter, Barry Buzan, is suggesting us that, in fact, via critical security studies at MOST and via within international security studies in general, it's possible to find a link. And mostly, this can be found, before we move on with more critical perspectives, this can be found really at the first sight when we take a look at the realist approach or the realist element within English School. In practice, however, the great bulk of English School work has focused on international and world society and on the rules, norms, and institutions, so more Grottian and Kantian perspective, so to say, that underpin the social order of international society. So, it's possible to say that few within the English School have explicitly addressed the international security studies agenda, and the concept of security does not play much role in English School thinking. It's therefore reasonable for us at this session to ask, and in general, of course, what a chapter on English school is doing within critical security studies and international security studies understanding. So there are a few questions in order to ask, to pose, in order to find out this link, in order to discover this link between English school and international security studies, not limited for sure, critical security studies in that respect. So we would ask, can we view the English school as a general theoretical framing for international security studies comparable with realism, liberalism, and Marxism? So at that point, it's possible to say that the English school's understanding of security, which is mostly put forward by Hadley Booth, is one of the elementary or primary goals of social life. Without security against violence, there can be no society. So it's possible to see by looking at Hadley Booth's understanding before we move on with the comparison sort of between realism, liberalism, Marxism and English school as a theoretical perspective when it comes to international security studies, it's possible to say that, in fact, at the very core of English school understanding, which pays a lot of attention, of course, to the international society, it's possible to find there security lying at the core, at the heart of international society, as put forward by, as I mentioned, by Hadley Booth, as it's the elementary or primary goal of social life. And it's believed that without security understanding, so without threats and without those objects which are basically threatened by these threats, so without referent objects in general, it's not basically possible to put forward a definition of international society. So after this side note, which is a very important one in fact, which would provide us a guidance in order to approach English school and international security studies, let's move on with further, if you like, understanding of international security studies, theoretical approaches, other theoretical approaches. Very briefly we will highlight them and move on directly towards English school understanding of international security studies. So at this point it's possible to say that international security studies doesn't stand by itself for sure. Its traditional core of strategic studies, they focus on state, national security and sees threats and poses largely in military terms. So this is the world, a more of a Hobbesian, realist world, where security studies, mostly during the Cold War period, of course, it actually grew in parallel to this military threat, actually nuclear war threat. So it was therefore, it is quite understandable to view that security studies, international security studies, in conjunction to state security and military terms. So when we take a look at the quickly take a look at the overview of other approaches to security studies, this would even further provide us further guidance about how English school can be actually implemented as a theoretical framework for understanding, international security studies. So when we consider realism, we see that they have quite, of course, state-centric approach. We already discussed them in the previous sessions, but I think this quick overview can provide us still further insights. So realism has, of course, quite state-centric approach, as we discussed. Power political it is, and conflictual understanding of international relations, and it provides a complementary and close-fitting general framework for strategic studies. When we move on with Marxism, which we haven't discussed yet in this, within the scope of this course, but which we will move on after English school, it puts forward that actually a power political and conflictual, if not state-centric, understanding of international relations can also serve as a general theoretical framing for international security studies. When we move on with liberalism, though, with its emphasis on intergovernmental and transnational institutions, cooperation and joint gains, the framing it provides, it emphasizes possible, ameliorations and/or exits from the permanent conflicts and security dilemmas of the realist and Marxist worlds. So it is possible to see that each of these three approaches, they provide us quite a different perspective about understanding threats, security threats, and referent objects within international politics. So in the light of these, if you like, different theoretical approaches, realism, Marxism and liberalism, it's possible to say that, in a nutshell, English school framing for international security studies can be set out as following types of international society and can provide us a different perspective about understanding threats and referent objects in international politics, quite different from the previous three approaches that we quickly overviewed. So, types of international society, we said that, in fact, English school puts forward different types of international society, and this forms actually its essence, its core, if you like, is a theoretical approach. Power political type of international society stands as the first, if you like, element, the first understanding in this fashion. And it represents an international society based largely on enmity and the possibility of war, but where there is also some diplomacy, alliance, making and trade. So survival is the main motive in power political type of international society, and few values are shared basically within power political type of international society within the framework of English school. So within that understanding, institutions, it is believed, will be minimal, mostly confined to rules of recognition and diplomacy. And quite a bit of ancient and classical history looks like this, it is believed. And the units composing such a society may be empires, city-states, nomadic barbarians, as well as states in the modern states. So it's a hypothetical case actually. It's a form of type of, as we mentioned earlier, of international society which can be viewed as quite significant, if you like, classification or categorization which takes place within English school with, of course, further insights about our understanding of security. So war is quite likely in power political international society, therefore, where a possibility for cooperation it exists, but it's a very limited, in a very limited framework it exists, we would say. Another type of international society, again, which is framed by English school, is a coexistence. And it is modeled on the exemplar of pre-1945 Europe, meaning the kind of Westphalian system in which the core institutions of international society are the balance of power, sovereignty, territoriality, diplomacy, great power management, war, and international law. So the units within coexistence type of international society is believed to seek some degree of international order, but remain again distinct and self-centered still, and not infrequently warlike. So war is quite likely, again, in coexistence type of international system, international society. But what differentiates it from the previous power-related, as we put forward, power political international society is the fact that there exists, and in a limited amount, of course, in a limited framework, there exists if you like, the first steps of international law. So when we take a look at pre-1945 Europe, it's possible to see actually the repercussions of this and the reflections of this understanding at the same time. So the third type of international society, again put forward by English school, is cooperative. So cooperative means that the units seek a level of order sufficient to pursue some joint projects. So world economy, for instance, human rights, big science, they can be considered as joint projects of humanity, which are sought by basically, if you like, the units of the international system, international society, at a sufficient level to cooperate up to a degree. And it might come in many guises, depending on what types of values are shared and how and why they are shared, though the standard model here is based on a shared liberal values. So cooperation within cooperative type of international society doesn't require always broad ideological specific, if you like, agreements, but only instrumental commitments to specific projects. So the contemporary commitment, therefore, to the market is a good example with many illiberal and non-democratic countries willing to play by international market rules. So probably war within cooperative international society becomes downgraded as an institution, and other institutions might arise to reflect the solidarist joint projects. So in this cooperative international society understanding, English School puts forward that, in fact, we come up with certain joint projects, and actually joint projects by the units within international society stands as the most important aspect of cooperative international society. And it's believed that up to a degree, certain norms and values are also shared by the international society within cooperative international system, international society type. And it's also possible to say that besides basically sharing certain norms and values up to a degree, it's not necessarily the case where each and every unit shared up to a same degree, same norms and values. So if you like, in this respect, it's possible to say that market understanding, this market rules, shared market rules, and liberal perspective, shared liberal values, can be considered as shared values and norms in that respect in cooperative understanding. And the possibility of war, which is the main question in security studies, of course, we need to highlight it for sure within each and every type of international society. It's seen that it's less likely. So it's downgraded as an institution, it's believed, due to or as a result of certain shared liberal values and market understanding in this respect. When we move on with another type of international society, again, within the framework, within the perspective of English School, we see that convergence appears to be another type, and it means the development of a substantial enough range of shared values within a set of states to make them adopt similar political, legal, economic forms, and to aspire to be more likely. So the usual models here is perceived to be European Union, or democratic peace theory also puts forward exactly the same framework. But in principle, any shared ideological, if you like, base could underpin convergence. So the range of shared values simply has to be wide enough, as it is, for instance, in democratic peace theory, as hypothesized in democratic peace theory, or as it is seen up to a degree in the European Union. And they need to be also, the shared values and norms, they need to be also substantial enough to generate similar forms of government. Liberal democracies, Islamic theocracies it might be, communist totalitarianism, but it should be shared in general. And legal systems based on similar values in respect of such basis issues as property rights, for instance, human rights, and the relationship between governments and citizens, they are actually viewed within this framework of shared values and norms in convergence type of international society. So it's believed that within international society, convergence type of international society, in fact, units, they shared to a great extent, up to a great degree, like it is in European Union, it's believed or observed by Barry Busan. They shared up to a great extent, to a great degree, certain values and ideals. And this led them to form a convergence type of, if you like, international society, where, of course, war is less and less likely. So it's more ideal type of understanding, so to say, of the international society. So, in order to comment further on all these types of, if you like, international society and how we can use them, what they tell us actually about international security, it's possible to say that from the spectrum that what type of international society one is in has huge consequences for what the agenda of international security will look like. So, life, therefore, within a power political international society, for instance, will be extremely different from life in a cooperative or convergence one. So it's also clear that these international societies, they represent forms of social order quite distinct from the materialist sense of order represented by the distribution of power in realism. So The most, if you like, original idea behind English school and security studies is to put forward, if you like, quite different from at the same time from realism and liberalism, what determines the possibility of war and the avenues, if you like, for cooperation is not always material distribution of power, as it is put forward by realism and as well as liberalism. It is critical up to a degree because it puts forward that English school, it's quite different in that respect from mainstream approaches, because it puts forward that, in fact, what determines the possibility of war and cooperation, it's not material capabilities, material distribution of power, but it's the ideals shared by units within the international society. So therefore, it's important to understand the type of international society where distribution of, if you like, ideals or shared ideas are described, or the type of international society are generally described based on the extent of shared values and norms by the units. So this is why it is believed that, for instance, in convergence type of international society, of course, the possibility of war will be less likely, it will be downgraded, and there will be further avenues for cooperation where values are shared in general, like it is in the European Union. So this ideal, this perspective, which is based on basically ideals instead of materialist sense of order, appears to be extremely original and a huge contribution at the same time to our understanding of, if you like, international security. So let's take a look at, for the last, if you like, few more comments, to look at security concerns in cooperative and convergence international societies, where it is believed that actually war is less and less likely compared to the previous two, if you like, type of international society. So the classical English school view of coexistence international societies, like the realist one, stresses great powers, war and balance of power as key institutions of social order, because there are really less and less shared international, if you like, sort of values and norms. And in cooperative, whereas, and convergence international societies of almost any conceivable sort, war and balance of power will be respectively marginalized or nearly eliminated as institutions. Let me repeat once more, dear students, what is the main discussion, what is the main argument behind, if you like, this type of conceptualization in terms of English school? It is mainly the idea of the extent of shared values, shared ideals by the units within the international society. If they share more common ideals, as we said, they can be considered as more cooperative or convergence type of international societies. But as you may see, actually conceptualization within international society, types of international societies, there is a broad range also. There are 4 different types in that respect. So there are different levels of shared values to understand, so to say, to acknowledge in this fashion. And whereas in the previous, for instance, like in coexistence type of international society, in fact, since values are shared less and less, war is more likely. So it is based on ideals, shared ideals. So it's our main reference point while understanding the perspective of English school and the possibility of war and cooperation at the same time, or let's say in general, let's conceptualize it in general as international security, so to say, the perspective of English school on international security. So, in place of conclusion, elimination of war doesn't mean that such societies have no security agenda. So far, while defining the types of international society, we said that, in fact, as much as units within international society shared certain values, war becomes less and less likely. So does that mean that, for instance, in convergence type of international society, we have no security agenda at all on the behalf of units? In fact, it's not possible to argue that. And it's important to put forward that, in fact, contemporary practice, for instance, of the European Union or other liberal international economic order, which resembles a lot to convergence type, security concerns move away this time from traditional military ones towards more economic, societal, and environmental ones, and human security agenda. So it's not therefore plausible to argue that once we have shared values and come up with shared understanding of, for instance, liberal economies, liberal values in general, and market understanding, liberal market understanding, we eliminate completely, totally the, if you like, the threat of any security threat or threat of war at the same time, but mostly any security threats. It's not possible to say that, because in contemporary understanding, when we further observe, as we put forward here, the European Union example, beyond traditional sort of military security threats, it's possible to see different security threats which are more populated by different security agendas, like economic ones or societal ones or environmental security threats. At this point, it's possible to say that we have further and different, if you like, security agenda in the 21st century. An English school perspective can provide us very good insights in terms of understanding how the ways in which, let's say, or the extent to which further values can be shared, if you like, to also tackle with some of the problems which are stemming from economic insecurities or securities or insecurities stemming from economic problems, societal problems, or environmental problems. So I would conclude by saying that, therefore, English school perspective is extremely helpful theoretical framework to understand, and mostly in the 21st century security agenda, security, if you like, context, mostly in a time where we end up with so many security challenges quite different from military security threats, which was, in fact, a security threat more significant within the Cold War agenda. So thank you very much for joining us today. In next session, in next time, we will be talking about critical security studies, and IVS English School perspective will provide us such a good theoretical background, and we will also be able to discover the links between English School and critical security studies in the upcoming session. Thank you very much for joining me today.